So we want to welcome Chad Dumas to EdChange Global. We thank you for sharing your time and your professionalism and your knowledge with us this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to you. So good luck with your presentation.
My pleasure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you come from. I think we're all good morning or good afternoon folks on here. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be able to share with you some tools and refine some of your skills to access all of our expertise. And before we jump into the content here, just one very brief housekeeping item. And that is that on the front page of the handout, which I am chatting in, if you don't already have that link to the handout, but it is included in the description to this session, as well as on the scheduling front page there in the Educators Change Global document. And then I just put it in the chat, but that's the link to this PowerPoint, which has a link to the handout down there on the lower left-hand corner of the page. You can see that, and it'll force you to create a copy so that you can take notes. If you want to print it out, that's wonderful, or if you want to just take notes on it, but it has areas for you to be able to take notes as we move through our presentation today. So Bob Marzano and Rick DeFore are some of the greatest educational thinkers and leaders of our time, and they say that no single person has all the knowledge, the skills, and the talents to be able to improve a school or to meet the needs of every child in his or her classroom. Michael Fullen, who's one of the great educational leaders of our time, and specifically around change, he says all the good work in schools, and you know there's a lot of good work happening in schools. He says all of that good work is just tinkering unless we clarify our identities as collaborators and as inquirers. So when you think about these two quotes from these two great leaders, or three great leaders, two quotes from three great leaders around, nobody knows enough. And we're just tinkering unless we're getting to our identities as collaborators and identities. What comes to mind for you? I invite you to just unmute yourself and share some of your thoughts. What comes to mind for you around these two quotes, please?
I think it really talks about the idea of risk taking and how the smartest person in the room is the room, and we all have to kind of work together.
Yeah, thank you. Diana says she agrees in the chat. Adele, have anything you'd like to add around these two quotes? Eric definitely agrees. Better together, yeah. Welcome, Sheila, I'm assuming that's how you pronounce your name. Welcome, glad to have you. So with these two ideas in mind, that kind of frames this session of this idea of the power of we, that none of us knows enough, and that we have to build our skills and our identity to be able to effectively work together in order to improve student learning. And this idea of tinkering, I used on this image. You'll notice this image of somebody working on a car. Sometimes people talk about, like, I remember my grandfather, he would tinker in the garage. And it just reminds me of this idea of going, and he'd spend all day sometimes in the garage and never get anything done. You know, just tinkering, messing around with this and that and the other thing. And I think that's a really powerful image in our work, that we are doing a lot and we are working really hard. And yet Michael Fullen, who knows a thing or two about schools, says that all of that is just messing around. It's not getting anything done unless we get to our identities, who we are. Thank you, Diana, sharing that isolation doesn't produce the change that we want. Yeah, thank you. So the challenge before us is really, in my mind, really threefold. And the pandemic has really exacerbated these challenges for us. So the first challenge is this challenge of isolation. Like, humans, even though we're more interconnected than ever before, feel more isolated than ever. The US spends trillions of dollars, just the US, a year in mental health services because people don't feel connected to each other. I saw a study that I think it was a fourth, maybe it was a half of spouses, married couples, said that their pet listens better to them than their spouse. And in some cases, they were referring to their crawdad. So there's this isolation, and then the pandemic has exacerbated that we don't feel connected to each other. In the US, there's been a rising awareness of the importance of social justice and the need for equitable practices wherever you go. The death of yet another unarmed Black man, George Floyd, last year, seemed to be like this spark that really, if we didn't understand the need for social justice before, it's been brought clearer to our eyes in the importance of equitable practice. And of course, through all of this, just added stress levels higher and higher and higher and higher. And you can go to Amazon and Google self-help books, and the number just keeps climbing and climbing and climbing because the level of stress in society is that high. Now, I'm somebody that doesn't like to just be a Debbie Downer or a Debbie. I'm sorry for using your name, but that's the term that many people use. Maybe there's Debbie. Do you have a different term for Debbie Downer? No. Nope. Okay. So let's look at the opportunities, because with every challenge comes opportunities. And so there are some opportunities before us. With increased recognition of isolation comes this opportunity to recognize that really we are all connected, interconnected, and one human family working together. The importance and need for equitable practices, and that as a society, we can get better little by little, day by day, over time. We can and we will get better. However, we have to have some skills to do that. And that's where the power of we comes in. When we're born into this world as these little tiny 6 to 9 pound children, little babies, infants, we're highly dependent. We are dependent on food, on our parents for food, for shelter, for everything about our existence. We're highly dependent. And as we progress through our life and we journey, we become toddlers and then children and adolescents. And we start to realize that we can be independent. And those of us who have been parents or get to look forward to becoming parents someday, or remember back on your own time, we remember this time of pushing back, right? And toddlers, the terrible twos, they're called, because of the no, they're pushing back. They're trying to gain independence. And as adolescents, the independence urge becomes stronger and stronger. And then we move through independence and we recognize somewhere maybe around university level or shortly after that really it's not just about independence, but it's about interdependence, that we do rely on each other and we can't go it alone. And finally, I think the last stage that maybe as humanity we're starting to recognize is that not only are we interdependent, but really are one. It's like the body, the human body, one human body. It's not just interdependent, but it's one. Everything is connected to each other. And so what are the skills that can help us get to that? In order to get to those 3+1 skills, here's what you'll be able to do by the time we're finished today. You'll be able to identify those 3+1 skills to help us access the power of we. As we do that, you'll also be able to think about and recognize what are your personal strengths and areas of growth that you see for yourself. And finally, as part of all this, it doesn't do any good unless we take and put that which we in words into reality and action. So planning for next steps, both for how you might use these skills in virtual settings and in person. So I've shared with you this idea of the power of we and challenges and opportunities, and set the agenda or the outcomes before you with this agenda. And I'm going to put you into breakout groups for just 2 or 3 minutes and have a brief conversation with that 1 or 2 other person. Which of these outcomes or agenda items really speak most to you and why? What questions might you have before we head into these breakout rooms? All right, so which outcomes or agenda items speak most to you? And of course, you'll want to introduce yourself to your colleague, where you're from, your background, et cetera. So 2 or 3 minutes. and they should be open for you. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. So anyone like to share any like commonalities that you noticed between you as you talked about these outcomes or agenda items?
Yes, actually, I was in a group with Sheila and Debbie, and something that we were sharing in common is that we are avid readers. We're always growing, and we're always learning, and we're always trying to improve ourselves.
Wonderful. Wonderful. That's fantastic. You know, it's always one of the things I love on Zoom is that when you close the rooms, you can tell where people are in the conversations, if they were ready to be done or not, because if they weren't ready to be done, everybody comes back at once because it, you know, shuts it. So clearly you were enjoying that conversation and making those connections. Anyone else want to share anything that you talked about?
Well, I think because I was in the same discussion obviously with Diana, but just that, you know, we're both interested. Like I had heard you on the Leader of Learning podcast. That's where I first got introduced to you, that we're both really interested in learning more about, you know, how we can really, you know, amplify and, you know, really work on this work. So.
Excellent. Wonderful. How can we actually do this, right? It's one thing to know how important it is and to think about it, but then actually do it because human dynamics kind of get in the way. Thank you.
Yeah.
So the agenda, I've shared with you the challenges and the opportunities before you. Now we're going to really dig into what I call the 3+1 skills. And I should have called it the 1+3 because the one really comes first, but it sounds better to call it the 3+1. So that's what I refer to it as. So the 1 is about building rapport. And so we'll have a chunk on that. And then the 3 are on these 3 Ps, and we'll dig into that a little bit. And then at the end, give you just a couple of minutes to kind of organize and integrate your thinking for next steps moving forward. So let's dig into this 3+1. So the 3 comes from the work of cognitive coaching and adaptive schools. And these are 3 of the 7, what they refer to as norms of collaboration. 3 of 7 norms of collaboration. And they're called norms because what we want them to be is a normal part of our work. And typically they're not. And I would contend that that's probably because it's not part of our identity of being collaborators and inquirers, like Michael Fullen said in that first introduction quote. And so those 3 are around pausing, paraphrasing, and posing questions. And we will dig into those a little bit more. And by the way, in that order. These are powerful tools that you will find when you use these effectively with your spouse, your children, your parents, your aunts and uncles, your students, your colleagues. It doesn't matter who you use these skills with, the productivity will dramatically increase. The satisfaction of you and the others will also dramatically increase. And then the 1 is this idea of building rapport. And what is building rapport? So let's dig into these a little bit, starting with rapport. So first, before I share with you about rapport, I like to share that I was Googling images for rapport, which is R-A-P-P-O-R-T. And this image came up as an image. And I thought that is a really odd image to have for rapport. And then I thought, well, I think it maybe thinks that I was Googling raptor. So we don't want rapport to be like a raptor, but I thought the image was funny anyway. And I'll share with you a couple of additional resources. I'll share some of the work of a gentleman by the name of Michael Grinder, or Grinder, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, and Kendall Zoller, Z-O-L-L-E-R. Those 2 gentlemen are some pretty good experts in the field of communication science and do a lot of work around rapport and how to build rapport. So they may be some additional resources for you. But what is rapport? Rapport is basically being in relationship with someone. And when we are in relationship with someone, our bodies physically start to manifest that relationship, that rapport. When you lean forward, I will lean forward. When you lean back, I will lean back. If you use large gestures, etc. This rapport manifests itself in mirroring, not mimicking. Mimicking will just tick people off, but in a mirroring, like when somebody does something, then the next person does it in a few seconds later. And if you go to a restaurant, this is beautiful. Go to a restaurant, you'll see mirroring in action. You can tell from 100 yards away who are the people in that restaurant who are in a fight and who are the people who are in rapport. Because the people who are in a fight, they will not have similar body language at all. It's all completely unconscious, subconscious, unless you raise it to consciousness. And yeah, as Diana said, body language communicates a lot. So these are some of the areas in which that body language is manifest. So in the body language, like the way we comport our bodies, in our voice tone, and I'll get into the voice tone a little bit more with a paraphrasing and posing questions, and in the volume and intensity in which that person is speaking. So when you are with somebody, you want to think about, if you're particularly those that maybe you know, like for me, there's certain people that I know that probably this is going to be a rough conversation because we're not in relationship with each other. We just don't see eye to eye on a whole heck of a lot of things. I go into that conversation much more mindful about how am I going to make sure that I mirror their physical, their body language so that we can make sure that we're in rapport. But don't take it from me. Let's take a look at Tony Robbins, and just a 2-minute clip where he'll talk a little bit about rapport.
There is something that always works to get rapport, and it's something called matching and mirroring. The person who pointed out was Milton Erickson. He understood that you have both a conscious mind and a subconscious mind. And he knew the subconscious is more powerful. It's the part that makes your heart beat 100,000 times a day without having to think about it. And he began to notice something about human beings, that when human beings got together, if they got in rapport, a relationship of responsiveness, they became like each other in a variety of ways. What he called, they mirrored each other. But here's the basis of it. People like people who are like whom? Themselves. And people don't like people who are not like themselves. To be more specific, write this down. People like people who are like themselves or who are like how they would like to be. Now, if you want to be effective then, mirroring is so easy. We do it naturally, but here's the problem. Most people wait till they have enough words in common, and then they put the voice in common and the body in common. But words are only 7%, they don't work all the time. Breathing is very powerful, one of the most powerful. If you breathe at the exact same pace as another person, you will feel what they are feeling, period. But you got to be breathing from the same location, the same tempo. And breathing is magnificent because it really hooks you to this person. You don't have to mirror everything someone does to have rapport. It's not like they lift their leg, you lift your leg, they lean forward, you lean forward, they sit back, you sit back. You don't have to do that. Although, believe it or not, you can do it a lot of people not even notice. But for example, you get rapport just with the leg position and maybe the tone of voice, because physiology is 55% of communication. If you're sitting there, let's say you cross your leg like this. Can I cross my leg like this while we're talking? Yes or no? It'll feel comfortable to you. So you start bouncing your foot like this, back and forth. Can I bounce my foot at the same tempo? If I do, you'll feel totally connected to me.
So as he said, we typically notice rapport with people who we are easy to get in rapport with, who we like and who we're in a relationship with. What we have to think about as leaders is, how do we make sure we get in rapport with those that we know we're going to struggle with, whether it's kids or adults? So how do you do that? Here are those big areas that he kind of talked about, and I'll just emphasize. So head movement is one key area. So one of the things I always notice in folks is head movement, and it's particularly noticeable across cultures. Certain cultures have more or less head movement. I remember an elementary principal I worked with was of Russian descent. And when she spoke, her head moved almost nada. So I'm a person that my head tends to move a lot when I speak. So I had to be conscious of that to make sure that we could get into rapport so that we could have an effective relationship and effective, productive conversations. So I would be conscious about, in conversations with her, not moving my head. I don't know if that's a Russian thing or if that's just her, I don't know. But being aware of a person's head movement. Some people move it a lot, some people very little. Some will have more of a tilt. Pay attention, get into rapport. Arm movement, as he talked a little bit about, is this somebody who uses a lot of gestures or not? The size of those gestures. And of course, as he mentioned, leaning in and leaning out. So pay attention, be aware. Be aware of when you're not in rapport with someone, how can you get into rapport? And practice that. So before I move into the next segment, though, I've kind of talked for a little while here. Let's go into breakouts and just have a brief conversation with the people in that breakout room. What are you thinking about at this point? What's resonating with you? What are you disagreeing with, etc.? And if you haven't met the people in your group, go ahead and introduce yourselves to those. We'll just do maybe 2 or 3 minutes of brief conversation around what's rolling around your head with rapport. And they should be open, so you should be able to join your breakout now. Welcome. All right. So you've had a little chance to kind of think about rapport kind of on a big picture. Let's go into some more specific things. Thank you, Adele, for letting me know that I was muted. Appreciate that. I don't even know when I muted myself, but so that's kind of like in big picture rapport and body movement. Now let's talk a little bit about voice tone. So as human beings, we have a range of voices, and one of the most frequent range is this continuum that I'm going to share with you in a moment. So on one end of this continuum is an approachable voice. And when a person speaks in an approachable voice, their pitch tends to go up and down quite a bit. And typically at the end of a phrase, it goes up. You'll also notice that when a person speaks in an approachable voice, their head tends to move a lot more than if they're not in an approachable voice. And that actually facilitates the up and down intonation because the vocal cords are being stretched and shortened through that process of the head movement. So that is an approachable voice. And when a person speaks in an approachable voice, they are approachable. We want to be around them. On the other end of this continuum is a credible voice. And a credible voice, excuse me, is one that has a lot less modulation. Not only does it have a lot less modulation, but it ends on a downward pitch. Typically, that downward pitch will also be associated with a downward move of the chin. You'll notice there's a lot less head movement, a lot less gesturing. The credible voice is, when I think of those of you who are familiar with CNN News, James Earl Jones, when he says, "This is CNN." Nobody has a question. It's a credible voice. And when one speaks with a credible voice, we tend to listen. Now, we're not always in one or the other. We move between them, even in the same sentence, as I just did. What we want to do is pay attention to others. Where are they coming from? And match so we can get into rapport. We also want to be aware that when we speak in an approachable voice, that's seeking an invitational language, invitational conversation. When I'm in a credible voice, I'm typically not seeking conversation. I'm just telling you what I think. Now, you might be familiar with people in your organization who just speak in a credible voice all the time. And you might be familiar with people in your organization who they just speak in an approachable voice all the time. Typically, first-year teachers, they really struggle with classroom management because they say to kids, "Okay, children, come and sit down on the carpet." And nobody listens because the children are listening to the intonation. And we know that 60 to 93%, somewhere around there, of the meaning of our communication, excuse me, is through our nonverbals. So the children are listening to the intonation, all they hear is, They don't hear, okay, children, please come sit down on the carpet. Subtle shift, powerful in thinking about building rapport, and invitational with building colleagues so that we can access the power of each other. And then finally, in voice tone. I saw a meme on Facebook once. It said, no one in the history of being told to calm down has ever calmed down. It just doesn't work. What does work is matching volume and intensity. And then through matching and through being in rapport, we can bring that person down. I remember I learned about this shortly before becoming a principal. And there was one parent who constantly was in my office angry about whatever the school was doing or what I was doing. Maybe you have those parents. And she and I just didn't see eye to eye on it, hardly anything. And I was reviewing my notes from this training and saw this. And I went, you know what, the next time she's in, I'm going to try this. And so she came in blazing shortly after that, just furious in the office. And she was just like pointing, finger in my face, yelling, angry about whatever she was angry about. And I remember instead of saying, oh, calm down, I said, wow, you're really angry. Why don't you come into my office and we can talk about it? Without having the emotion, I placed the emotion in the room. I was in rapport with her. She came in, she knew that I understood her level of frustration, and we were able to have a productive conversation. Being in rapport. So I encourage you to think about these skills, practice, getting into rapport with body, with voice tone, with volume and intensity, and to think about how that might impact your practice. I'll invite you briefly to unmute yourself. What ahas or questions are rolling around in your head?
It just made me really think. I'm a really excited person. And when I share things, I get really jazzed up. And sometimes people are like, whoa, wait. And it makes me think as I work with my teachers as a tech coach that I need to pay more attention to what they're saying and try to mirror what they're saying versus going at it with the, excitement I normally do.
Yeah. Thank you. Other thoughts or questions rolling around?
To add to what you have said and what Debbie has said, I am also a very excited person naturally, but I also have to be mindful of the audience in the room. And even when I'm talking about something that is super exciting for me, I tend to speak very fast. My rate of speech changes, which makes my message not, my message is not well received across because they cannot even understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's so much to this, isn't it? Yeah, and as I'm laughing, I'm not intending to laugh at you. I'm laughing at the situation and thinking about, when just seeing that happening in places that does tend to happen, and many times we're not even aware of why it's happening. Oh, thank you so very much, Adele or Sheila. Anything you'd like to add?
Unfortunately, we are here teachers in United Arab Emirates, and because we are all expat from other countries, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and so on. You don't have any chance to speak to anyone in a strong voice. You have to be always calm and quiet. That's it. That's the way here. You have to be always calm, whatever you hear from other students or parents or even the administration department. You have to be so calm.
Yes. Yeah, and thank you for raising that, because there is some cultural twist on this. Like what I've shared with you is kind of like some general practices, but you also have to be aware of some cultural sensitivity issues that may exist where you are. Yeah, it's very true. Thank you. Okay. So now that we've kind of laid this foundation of the one, we'll just spend a little bit of time on this idea of the three. And I'll briefly share with you some highlights on these skills and then give you a couple minutes to organize and integrate. So these three are on this screen for you, and I mentioned them earlier: pausing, paraphrasing, and posing questions. So I'd like to invite you for just a minute to read the handout. There's a link to the handout here. And I will put the link to the entire PowerPoint in case you need that as well. But there's a link to this handout where there's these three norms. I'll give you like a minute to read those three norms. It's fairly short. I'll mute myself and let you read. Would you give a wave if you need some more time to read those three? All right. So pausing is really important because, unfortunately, as miraculous as the brain is, the thinking part right up here, the prefrontal cortex, that blue image on the screen, it's really slow. It's between 2 and 8/10 of a second slower than the amygdala, which is the fight or flight response. So we have to purposely and intentionally pause. As Tony Robbins said, a good breath will do wonders. Actually, our breathing is the most powerful nonverbal move that we can make. So pause, give yourself a chance to think. And that breathing is really powerful. The breath not only gives you a chance to breathe, to think, but it also increases blood circulation, increases the oxygen in the bloodstream, and allows that to get to the front part of the brain, which also, by the way, is the farthest from the heart. The amygdala is much closer, and we want to be in the thinking part of our brain in order to access the power of we. And I've been told that on digital platforms, we need to double the amount of time that we give for processing. Now, when you double it, one of the things that's a little trick is make sure that you don't just pause, because right now you might have started to think that I was frozen. And so when you pause, you need to do something. So what I have done very intentionally is whenever I pause, I take a drink of water. So that way you know that my technology isn't frozen and that you need to do something different with your technology, but you can actually think. So some kind of movement is important. In terms of paraphrasing, there's 3 types of paraphrasing. One is an acknowledgement, and I shared that with you earlier. Wow, you're really frustrated. Why don't you come into my office? I've simply acknowledged those emotions. A second paraphrase is to organize. I sometimes refer to it as verbal vomit. Somebody comes into your office and they just vomit all over you verbally, right? All these problems. And they don't even realize that they shared 3 different things with you. And so you can organize their thinking and say, so, after a pause, it sounds like you're concerned about 3 things. 1 is blah, blah, blah. 2 is blah, blah, blah. And 3 is blah, blah, blah. An organizing paraphrase can be really helpful to access each other's thinking. And finally, the abstracting, which is quite difficult and we'll not go into here, but you can do some research on that because it really is a higher level of skill in paraphrasing. And then finally, some tips around posing questions. Avoid the phrase why, because it triggers defensiveness. And if you add in, why did you? Oh, amygdala's kicked in, fight or flight, don't even go there. So avoid that phrase. Instead, what were some of the things you were thinking about? Or what were some of the prompts that made you go in that direction? Or what were some of the things that were rolling around that, right? And avoid why and you. Using tentative language also goes with open-ended language. And finally, plural forms. And I will, oops, sorry about that. And fingers flying around on the mouse there. So I encourage you to practice these. Think about them. How can you use them in your work? So before I go to the closing here, because we are just about 8 o'clock, what's rolling around your head for you right now? What are you thinking about with these skills and the rapport? Nothing, huh?
I'll add in my thoughts.
Yeah.
My head of school, who I think is fantastic, and I have completely different learning styles. She's extroverted, I'm introverted. So I always say talking to her is like talking to a ping pong ball, because her ideas sort of, you can have an hour meeting with her and she'll have 35 different ideas. So the idea of paraphrasing with her has really helped me, that when I'm done with a meeting, excuse me, I always say, these are the 3 things you want me to focus on, or the 3 things I'm going to focus on. And then I always follow that up with an email, because she will like forget what she said. And that has worked for like getting a really good rapport with her. But I think I just want to say, like, all of your suggestions are things that I would definitely use and practice.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. Appreciate that. So as we started out with this challenge and the opportunities before you, my sense is that these 3+1 skills can be really powerful in accessing the power of all of us to be able to move forward. And I will just close here by sharing, there's a slide here with some of the, I am a consultant. And so there's some services that I provide to different schools and districts. This is just a starting point. Everything is customized for everyone. And so those are linked there. And please do tweet out, reach out to me with your thoughts or questions. Obviously, a 45-minute session isn't enough to do everything, but we got a good start. So thank you so very much. Appreciate the top opportunity to engage with you, and have yourselves a wonderful rest of the conference.
And Chad, once again, thank you on behalf of the organizing team and all the participants. This was a really great session. The next session in